Welcome in to the Tuesday edition of the 14. I am joined by both Blake Lovell and Barry Allen. We will do a split episode where we will talk some basketball and some baseball. Let's start with hoops. Just minutes before we started this, Blake, the SEC has released its all-conference team. The first team is Herb Jones, John Petty Jr., Moses Moody, Trey Mann, Cam Thomas, Devontae Shuler, Drew Smith, and Scottie Pippen. The second team, Jaden Shackelford, Colin Castleton, Xavier Wheeler, Javonte Smart, Trendon Watford, DJ Stewart, Jeremiah Tillman, and A.J. Lawson. All freshman team, Josh Primo, Moody, Sharif Cooper, K.D. Johnson, Isaiah Jackson, Cam Thomas, Keon Johnson, and Jaden Springer. And the all-defensive team, Herb Jones, Isaiah Jackson, Abdul Adu, Drew Smith, and Yves Pons. Coach of the Year, Nate Oates at Alabama. Player of the Year, Herb Jones. Scholar Athlete of the Year, Dylan Dessou. Freshman of the Year is Moody. Sixth Man of the Year, J.D. Notae. And Defensive Player of the Year, no surprise, Herb Jones. That's a mouthful there, Blake. Let me start with you and your thoughts on what the SEC has done here.
Well, the first team, we got 7 of the 8 when we did our player rankings, and I think it turned out about kind of how we did it in terms of what we came up with. We said we picked Herbert Jones as our player of the year. I can't, disagree with that. We did make the case, too, for Moses Moody making a pretty late push there, I think, to be right there with him in that discussion, even though Moody won the freshman of the year. But the only guy we didn't have in that the top 8 that was the SEC's all first team SEC awards, which, by the way, having 8 guys on it, I still think is absolutely ridiculous. But the only guy we didn't have was John Petty, who we had at number 9. So we weren't too far off in terms of our thoughts on it, and I guess the coach's thoughts on it. So it is what it is. Like we said, I think once you get beyond the first team all SEC group, you can make a lot of cases for some of those guys, like Xavier Wheeler and DJ Stewart and guys like that we discussed. I mean, AJ Lawson was the one, too, that I was thinking of. We even kind of said we probably may have left him out maybe a bit more than we should have. So I can't, argue with any of this in terms of where these guys at. I think, Chris, the one we would look at probably would be a guy like Darius Days, but at some point, like we said, LSU still gets 3 guys on this list of their big 4. So just in terms of those first and second team groups, I think it turns out just sort of really as you would expect. And I know people have already pointed out a couple guys that maybe belong in there. Iverson Molinar is one that I would probably look at potentially on that second team, maybe ahead of a couple guys in there. And then other people, have talked about Justin Smith, too, from Arkansas. He certainly was a huge part of them making the run they did. So that's just some of the things that stand out. I can't really disagree with a whole lot when it comes to really either of those teams. Again, you're going to have guys that get left out. But overall, I thought the actual picks for, player of the year, Herbert Jones, freshman of the year, Moses Moody, that's kind of what we thought. And it sort of turned out the way we expected.
Well, a couple of comments before I throw it to Barry for his thoughts. Like you said, not a lot of surprises. I think that Dylan Dessou was one that was going to be interesting to see how the league treated it. We had him in our 14, but that was right before he got hurt. So I don't think that the league necessarily made a mistake by keeping him off the team. I can respect its reasons. Emmanuel Miller at Texas A&M falls in that category for Dylan, and he was the SEC's player of the week. He's been on fire since the Aggies started playing ball again. But I think I was interested to see what the league did with Mississippi State. Like I've said many times, they had 3 really good players, and DJ Stewart, who was the guy who made the team. Molinar and Smith were the other 2. I just had a hard time distinguishing between who the best of those 3 was. I think my opinion might even change from game to game. That's one of those, probably unless you watch them every game, just hard to say. So I think that I don't think I would have put Xavier Wheeler on the team for reasons I've articulated before. Not that he's a bad player, but his shooting efficiencies just were not very good. That tends to get rewarded on these type of teams time and time again. The other omission that struck me a little bit, and you can reference our interview that we did with Kermit Davis on Monday. I asked him point blank, who was your best defensive player? And he said Luis Rodriguez, and he said it without hesitation. I think that as good as Ole Miss was on that end of the floor, to me, leaving the best player on one of the league's probably three best defensive teams off that team might have been an omission.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting discussion because, like we said, I put this out on Twitter too, and the SEC had to put this. I noticed they followed up their initial tweet they did with this note right underneath it, in that we have to remember, like the coaches are voting on these awards, not the media. And I see already a lot of people already throwing their way into my mentions and the SEC's mentions in terms of thinking that this was voted on by the media. It wasn't. So this is the coaches thing. Like they have made these picks in terms of who they think, kind of go into these particular groups. And so I think it's interesting, like some of those you mentioned, I think the Molinar-Stewart debate in Mississippi State's one where I would probably, like you said, change my pick on those guys at times. And then you mentioned a guy like Rodriguez, from a defensive standpoint, if you think Ole Miss is one of the best defensive teams in the league, which they were this season, how much consideration? Obviously, we'll never know kind of what the votes look like, but I'm always curious to know kind of, of the ones that didn't make the first and second team All SEC, who were the guys that got the most votes behind? Like, who was the next person waiting, or the next two, or whatever? I'm always kind of curious to know. Obviously, again, we'll never know, but I think that's one of the fascinating aspects of it too. So, I mean, again, it's a list that I really can't, like you said, I can't really disagree with a whole lot on there. If you go down to like the all freshman team, I mean, that's another one where that group is pretty much what we thought. And honestly, if Sharif Cooper plays more games, Sharif Cooper is probably on the first team All SEC. I would have to believe. He did make the freshman team. And then, that duo at Tennessee, Keon Johnson, Jaden Springer, no surprise to see both those guys on there. So, yeah, it's, not really a whole lot of surprises with this particular tier. But I think, again, when you have 8 guys on the All SEC first team and 8 on the second team, there's probably not going to be a whole lot of surprises. So if you just did 5, I think the debate would be a lot more interesting. But doing 8 just makes it. I don't know why they do it, but I guess there's a reason behind it. So
yeah, I would think as far as all league teams go, I would give them an A- for what they did. There's nothing glaring on here. There's nothing that I can't understand. I mean, even the Wheeler pick, I think is somewhat defensible. It's not where I would have gone, but I've seen much worse in terms of how all conference teams were done. Frankly, I think they did a better job with this than they generally do in baseball. But Barry, I want to throw it to you for your thoughts on the All SEC team.
Well, I think pretty good team. I think one thing that jumps out, and I'm trying to go back through the record book. I'm not having a ton of success here, but Kentucky doesn't have a first or second team selection. When in the world's the last time that happened?
yeah.
And I know they've not had a good year, but that's the thing that, that'd be like Alabama not having an All SEC player, in football. You just look at Kentucky and you say, they got to have somebody on their team, and it's just. I know they haven't had a good season, but that's kind of one thing that just kind of jumps out at you, that the big blue brand of SEC basketball is not represented on either the first or second team. And as y'all said, it is a coach's vote, and they can't vote for their own players. I see some banter on Twitter about Arkansas, Musselman, they thought he could have had a shot to coach of the year. They only had, I think, like one player on the first or second team, and Alabama had more than one. But I think when you look at, what Nate Oates did with Alabama, I don't think anybody thought Alabama was going to win the SEC in basketball this year, and not sure they thought they'd win it next year either. Just how quickly he turned things around, I think that's pretty good acknowledgement for him, within the rest of the league, what kind of job he did and what kind of team Alabama had this year.
Well, I'm thinking about Kentucky, and of course, the Wildcats had the worst season in forever. I think the last time they were this bad was probably Billy Gillespie's last year. No, I take that back. They made the NIT one year under Calipari just a few years back. But I think even then they had some good players. I'm guessing, if I had to just guess, I bet the last time Kentucky didn't have a player on the SEC team, man, I don't know. I would guess it would be when they were coming out of that probation, maybe the 13 and 19 year of 88, 89. I mean, I think it's been very probably decades.
Well, I'm back to 94 in the SEC record book, and I found a Kentucky guy at least once for every year. So it would have to be quite quite a long time. Maybe the Unforgettables or something on the team. But even in '88, they had they had a coaches all SEC selection, and I'm guessing in '89 they would have too with Mashburn or something on that team. But looking at the '89 all SEC team, just real quickly, Kentucky did not have anybody on the coaches team in 1989.
Yeah, that's the year I would have guessed. They had LaRon Ellis, Chris Mills were good players, but when you go 13 and 19, to the victors go the spoils, right?
Right. The '89 All SEC team was Michael Ansley, Ricky Blanton, Cameron Burns, Gerald Glass, Barry Goheen, Chris Jackson, Alec Kessler, Frank Cornett, Dyron Nix, and Dwayne Shinches on that '89 team. So Kentucky, at least back that far, it spans to '89 that Kentucky didn't have a selection on either of those teams, and it doesn't look like. Derek Miller made it in '90, so '89 looks like to be the focus point for the last time that happened for Kentucky. That's a long time for a good team with a great team with a great program to have that kind of history. That's a long time.
Blake, I'm going to throw it back to you for another basketball-related topic before we go over to baseball. You had a couple of NCAA tournament bids decided last night in the Sun Belt where Appalachian State wins and the Southern UNC Greensboro wins. That didn't affect anything because those were one-bid leagues anyway. Today we have the Colonial, the Horizon, the Northeast, the Summit, the West Coast, and the and the West Coast decided. That's where it stops. I don't think anything of note in terms of bracket ramifications for anybody, or particularly the SEC tonight that comes to mind. Let's see, the West Coast, I know Gonzaga won last night, and I didn't see who won BYU Pepperdine last night. But I think probably not much will happen today that will have any ramifications for the bracket or particularly the SEC that I can think of.
No, you're pretty much waiting until, I think, Wednesday to kind of start to see the games that will have an impact. And again, if you're Alabama and Arkansas, we know the situation. We've talked about it a lot. I think you're rooting if you're Alabama, you're rooting for an Illinois loss, even though I still think in that scenario, I've said it before, I think Illinois still winds up getting that other number one seed most likely. And then if you're Arkansas, you're trying to move ahead of teams like potentially Houston or Ohio State. I think it's going to be harder with Ohio State, but I think that's kind of where you're at is, I think the Big Ten teams are locked in. We had that discussion a week ago. The four Big Ten teams, Michigan, Illinois, Iowa, Ohio State, I feel like they're somehow going to land in getting four of those top 8 spots, meaning, the top 2 seeds. So I feel like that's where things are at there. But I think Arkansas, you're certainly looking at Houston. That's a team that you're probably saying, all right, if they get matched up with Memphis or something like that, you're probably rooting for Memphis because and what the thing is, we have to remember this. The committee, we have no basis to know how the committee is going to value certain things, and especially potentially conference tournaments, because the number of games played, the unique circumstances surrounding the season. So we could get some surprises, I think, on Selection Sunday, and I'd be surprised if we don't, because I think we're basing this all off of the traditional history of what the committee does and where they slot certain teams. But I don't think we really know what the impact of a loss in a conference tournament, let's say to a team like Houston or Illinois or teams like that. What is that exactly going to do? Because, how does the committee view that based on the circumstances of the season? And does that allow teams like Alabama and Arkansas to move up? And like we said, I don't think if you're a team like Florida, Tennessee, Missouri, LSU, I just don't think there's a whole lot that's going to change much of anything, except for what we talked about before, Chris. I think you have to try to stay out of that 8-9 game because I don't think you want any part of these number one seeds this year. Not that you ever do, but I think this group is just very, very strong. So I think if your teams like that, LSU making a good run in the SEC tournament would probably boost you out of that 8-9 game. So I think that's the biggest thing. Really, it's those 4 teams I don't think have a lot to really look at. Alabama and Arkansas, they kind of are where they are, and they're just kind of rooting to see if maybe they can move up a seed line. And then if you're Ole Miss, at this point, if you're Ole Miss, you're rooting against every team possible on the bubble because that's really the only way to put yourselves in position. And our guy, Rocco Miller, bracketeer.org, as of yesterday, he did have Ole Miss as one of his last teams in. So if you think about it that way, and I'm seeing other people starting to move them towards that. I know Lenardi still has them as like the sixth team out, but I do think people are starting to look ahead and say, well, Ole Miss beats South Carolina. They probably still need to beat LSU, but I think, again, it depends on what the rest of the bubble does. So if some of those bubble teams lose, then you start making those comparisons with Ole Miss and some of the other bubble teams. So it's going to be fascinating, I think, the next several days for sure, once the SEC tournament starts, but really watching a lot of these other bubble teams too.
Well, and we're starting to do our own prep work to where we can know exactly what we think of where these teams stand. So as losses happen in real time, I think we'll be able to add some value at the website and on the podcast and maybe some other things we're looking at doing too. But three teams, this is, well, I guess it's sort of SEC related because it affects the bracket. But I think this year in particular, you've got three really interesting mid-major teams. Like you've got Colgate sitting there at 8 in the NCAA's net rankings. I mean, if the NCAA puts Colgate in the tournament, say it wins the tournament, it puts it in as a 12 or 13 seed. I don't know what that says about what it thinks of its own ranking system. So I'll be interested to see how it does that. But I'll also be interested to see how it were to treat Colgate, say if it made the finals of the Patriot and then lost. I don't know how far down the net would fall, but that would be very interesting. Now, Colgate hasn't really played anybody, and I guess that would be the defense. But that'll be interesting. I don't think that anybody expects Colgate to get on it large, but again, when you've got an 8 in the ranking that the NCAA is using to select and seed its field, I think that's pretty loud. Loyola Chicago, a couple of spots back at 10. Same issue for Loyola, although it's got a couple of quad one wins. Where that team will be seeded is an interesting one. And then Drake, of course, which started 19-0 and again didn't play much of anybody, 47 in the net. Those are three that, and if you want to go a little further, Boise State maybe in the Mountain West too. I think those are teams that you really want to keep an eye on if you're Ole Miss. You're hoping those teams win their conference tournaments to make it a non-issue. But even if those teams do win the tournaments and get in, I think where those guys are seeded, that's going to be very interesting.
And here's another team that I think is going to be the most fascinating discussion potentially that we have, depending on how they do in their conference tournament. And if you're Ole Miss, this is a team you're rooting against. SMU has not played a game since February the 8th, and they are going to open up the American tournament on Friday against Cincinnati. They are 11-4 this season. What does the committee do with SMU? Like, I think that's one that's going to be really, because if you're Ole Miss and you're sitting there looking at your resume, and then you look up at a team like SMU, who's being right there in that, I think I've seen a lot of brackets that have had either SMU right in front of Ole Miss or right behind Ole Miss. Like, what is that comparison going to look like? And how are they going to make the differentiator and figuring out what is the difference between these two teams? Obviously, SMU can't lose to Cincinnati, but if they win that game, I'd have to pull up the bracket to see who they play next. But like that's one that I think is very, very interesting to see kind of what they do with that given the circumstances there. Because I don't think, like, SMU hasn't played since February 8th, but Tim Jankovich, of course, former Vandy assistant, he hasn't coached them since like January something, like, because he was out and then they kept playing. And so it's they're going to be a very interesting case. But that's the thing is SMU, Syracuse, Utah State, St. Louis, Memphis, teams like that. Those are the ones that if you're Ole Miss, those are the teams you're battling with right now. So I think those are the ones to keep your eye on if you're on the bubble like Ole Miss and you're trying to figure out, okay, who do I need to root against? You got to take care of your own business against South Carolina. But then, the path maybe gets a little bit easier if you don't beat LSU, if all these other teams kind of falter in their conference tournaments.
Well, and then you have UConn, which has missed a key player and is right in the middle of that discussion too. I mean, higher than Ole Miss, but you just have so many complications this year that I see this as sort of a no-win situation for the NCAA, because I think wherever it makes a move, it's going to open up a discussion about, well, you treated this team this way and you treated this team another way, and there's an apparent inconsistency there. Well, those are the things that just happen when you try to pick the 68 best teams. Sometimes something is really loud for another team and not as loud for another team. But then people take those comparisons and say, well, you were inconsistent here. You gave this team this based on that, but then you didn't take that for that team and apply it the same way. I just see this as, I don't know, maybe it sorts out and a lot of these bubble teams win, and a lot of these teams that are in the bubble win conference tournaments and things like that, to where it makes it more clear. But I think this is going to be an incredibly difficult year to be on the selection committee. And you could see this really being difficult going down to the wire on the Sunday through no fault of the committee's own.
Yeah, if you're the committee, I think you're trying to hope for and rooting for some sort of normalcy this week in conference tournaments, which is not a thing to hope for, because as we know, that's not just never happens. So that's what you want, because otherwise you're going to have some tough decisions to make when it comes to, like I said, let's say a team like SMU or some of these others that have had such sort of unique circumstances, and either knowing whether do we put them in the field or where do we put some of these teams in terms of where they could land. So, that's it. From an SEC standpoint, Ole Miss trying to get in. I think Florida and LSU, Missouri, teams like that trying to stay out of that 8-9 range. That's what you're hoping for, because I just don't think that's a good spot for any of those teams. So for Missouri, I still think they're probably going to wind up as a 7, but you don't want to lose to Georgia and maybe move back to that 8, because I wouldn't like that setup for them. And then the same obviously goes for Florida and LSU, although as we keep going back to LSU, look, if they have a good offensive game, maybe they could beat anyone, but I don't know that they want to be in that 8-9 slot for sure. So.
All right, let's flip it to baseball. Barry, I think the thing that stands out, the polls came out on Monday. The SEC has got the top 5 teams in the country, according to many of the rankings. Just incredible. Your thoughts on that and just how unprecedented something like that is?
Well, there's 6 polls, and 5 of the 6 have SEC teams 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and the other one has 1, 2, 3, 4, 6. So at least in the top 6, I think that has to be unprecedented. I can't ever remember anybody ever being that dominant. We all know that because we live here and we watch it every day, and we see these teams play day in and day out. So we believe it, and we understand how difficult it is. But just for the national people to see that, and I think the coaches vote on one of the polls, so they understand how good this league is, and I think it's tremendous for the league. And Arkansas is the consensus number 1, 6 polls, and they hold the top spot in all 6 of those for the first time ever, and they're playing really well. I think it just shows how good this league is, top to bottom. But I think it really shows how strong the league is, from the teams that are contenders for super regionals in Omaha.
Well, the other thing that stands out is the pitching in this league has been ridiculous. You start looking at the national strikeout leaders by team, and it's just going to be dominated by SEC teams. We had a no-hitter this weekend at Mississippi State for the first time in, 36 years. It is just incredible, the number of arms in this league. I was over at Vanderbilt on Sunday, sitting behind home plate, watching Jack Leiter pitch. That guy was just electric. Kumar Rocker threw the day before. I hate to use words like never, because the SEC has had crazy good pitching for the past 4 or 5 years, as far as I can remember, at least. And I mean, certainly further back beyond that. But this year has really been something else to watch.
Well, it really has, and been a lot of really good, pitching performances. I think this past weekend, we had a dozen shutouts. South Carolina's thrown back-to-back shutouts in their last 2 games against Mercer. I think there were 22 double-digit strikeout performances. Texas A&M struck out 21 against New Mexico State on Saturday. I mean, that means 6 outs were something other than a strikeout. I mean, that's ridiculous. Their 21 strikeouts were 1 shy of their school record, and it was the most times New Mexico State had ever been struck out. I think Vandy and South Carolina both had 17 strikeout games, and I think there were 8 if I remember correctly, 8 or 9, 15 strikeout games or more this past weekend. So, and 11 of the 14 teams had at least one shutout. Now, I don't know if that says about who you're playing or how great your pitching is. I think it's probably a combination of both, that you have dominant pitching and maybe the teams might not be as strong offensively, but still in aluminum bat college baseball, shutouts are really, really hard to come by. And the littlest of things can, make something happen and you score a run. And, if you're up 15-0 in the 8th and there's a runner at third or runner at second and 1 out or 2 out, no outs, you might get 2 ground balls and give up the run and it's 15-1 and say, well, that, they blew the shutout, but they're just trying to get outs and get out of it. Sometimes that's really hard, getting those shutouts and particularly with aluminum bats. But I think that's been phenomenal that this past weekend anyway, it trended to a lot of shutouts and a lot of strikeouts for a lot of dominant arms in this league.
Well, I'm looking at the stats of the 14 SEC pitching staffs. You only have 2 teams that have got fewer than 1 strikeout per inning on average. That's Auburn, which has 98 and 99 2/3 innings, and Missouri, which has 91 and 103 innings. So part of that's just that's the way the game is right now. It's high strikeouts at all levels, and we tend to blame the hitters, but you look at velocities everywhere. I mean, everybody's got guys throwing in the 90s, not even limited to Division I anymore, it seems like. But I want to ask you on the subject of pitching. You live in Tuscaloosa. What is the word on Connor Prelude when Alabama might get him back?
Well, I haven't heard anything on him updated. I know he's missed 2 weeks now. They said it was a medical condition. They said it could be a couple of weeks. So hopefully that will be something that Brad Bohannon will share tonight after they play South Alabama tonight on the SEC network, and then they play Jacksonville State tomorrow night. So hopefully that'll be some information that he will share, the next couple of days. I think for their sake, they need him to be back this weekend against Stetson. One, because I think Stetson's pretty good, but I think he needs some work before he takes it off to Arkansas next week. And I don't think you want to have him running. I don't think his first game back, you want him first game back at Arkansas against perhaps one of the hottest teams, in the country. I think you want to try to get his feet wet this week. So I would think they would want him at least at some point, if he can be back, to throw this weekend.
I'm looking across the schedule, and we've talked about the 5 or 6 teams at the top. But one of the teams that I was really anxious to see last weekend was Tennessee, and I didn't get to see any of that game. But I've been interested to know what the Vols had. I thought that the Georgia State series would tell us a little bit of something, because Georgia State went to Georgia Tech and just thrashed the Yellow Jackets in a midweek game. UT had a disappointing weekend the weekend before, losing 2-4 to Indiana State. The game against Dayton that it played in the midweek was supposed to play got canceled. The Vols do get a game with Austin Peay in the meantime. Tennessee's pitching against Georgia State, which is dominant. The Vols give up 2 runs in 3 games, win all 3. Any thoughts on what Tennessee's got at this point?
I think the jury may be still out a little bit on them. It does look like that they can pitch a little bit. They had a 6-hit shut Sunday in the series finale with 10 strikeouts. They did walk 5 guys. Mark McLaughlin started 3 2/3 scoreless, and then Elijah Pleasance came in and picked up the win with 2 1/3 scoreless innings and 3 strikeouts. Their starters to me this weekend, Heflin pitched really good Friday night. Their starters were 16 2/3 innings this weekend with 1 run allowed and 13 strikeouts. And only gave up 12 hits in 16 innings on the mound. They got tremendous starting pitching against Georgia State, who you said beat Georgia Tech, and they also beat Vanderbilt one game a couple of weekends ago. And it seems like that Liam Spence and Jake Rucker, Luke Lipsius, and Drew Gilbert's kind of the cog of their lineup. Rucker and Gilbert both hit 2-run homers in the 3rd inning on Sunday, and Rucker had a solid weekend, 6 for 12, with a home run and 6 RBIs. Looked like those top 3 or 4 spots in their lineup, kind of carry their team. But for this past weekend anyway, the story for Tennessee was their starting pitching, and if they can get that throughout the course of the year, they could be a very dangerous team.
I feel like we've done a disservice to Mississippi State by not talking about that historic no-hitter to this point in the podcast. State throws a freshman who I think throws 6 perfect innings, and then 3 relievers come in and finish the job. But that staff, 150 strikeouts in 99 innings. We've had a lot of talk. There's been a lot of chatter nationally about who's got the deepest staff, and Arkansas, I think, is got a deep staff. Everybody knew Florida did. Vanderbilt does for sure, but State, they've thrown like 22 or 23 pitchers last I checked, and whoever they threw out there on Sunday, it worked.
It did, and that was one thing that Chris Lamona said after the game. You're into through 6 innings, and you kind of get the feel. The crowd knows. The kids know that you got something special going. But he said, we got to take care of these kids, and we got to take care of their arms. And he only let Jackson Fristow, the freshman, throw 85 pitches in 6 perfect innings with 8 strikeouts, because he said, I've got other guys I've got to get in the game. And you want the no-hitter, you want the perfect game, but you've also got to get, we got a lot of guys in there that need to pitch. And then he went with Landon Sims and Mikey Tepper and Cam Tular, and they combined on the no-hitter in Starkville Sunday afternoon, beating Kent State 13-0. Got some really good defensive plays. There are some out there that Mississippi State's posted on their website, 3 unbelievable gems that helped keep that game and that no-hitter intact. Certainly the catch by Lane Forsythe from shortstop. Google it, find it. Incredible play. And you go, wow, that's how you pitch no-hitters, because you have guys making plays behind you. And Drew Gowan made a nice diving catch in left field, and Brandon Pimentel made a nice play at first base. But, they just ooze pitchers over there in Starkville. And Will Bednar, who had not pitched the first 2 weekends of the season, got in the game Saturday for the first time. And the fans seemed like, the media on Twitter and fans responding to what they see there were excited to get him in there. I think they feel like he could be a weekend guy for them. I know Sarantola didn't pitch well this weekend. I think that's 2 weekends. He's kind of struggled a little bit for them. So, maybe they make a change this week and, do something different. But they've got a lot of arms in Mississippi State, and they're not afraid to use them. And they've got some power arms, and they've got some guys that can come in situations, and guys that can come in for 1 out or 2 out. But they got a lot of depth on that pitching staff in Starkville.
Yeah, Sarantola has had some control issues in the past, and it appears they have popped up again. But you look at the stat sheet, it's ridiculous. But one thing that pops off the page, Landon Sims has thrown 8 2/3 innings. It struck out 22. So 22 of the 26 outs he has gotten have been via strikeout. He's given up 3 walks and 3 hits. I mean, you see some incredible strikeout numbers this day and age, and especially for relievers who can come in and just give it 100% and go all out. That lends itself towards more of that, but I don't know that I've seen a number like that, Barry.
No, and his first outing, I was trying to get to the box score reil quick. His first
I want to say he struck out 10, yeah, if I remember.
Yeah, I think he was 12 up, 12 down, and had 10 strikeouts at Globe Life Park in the opening weekend of the season. He came in 4 perfect innings, and 10 of his 12 outs were strikeouts. I think that was the game against TCU. No, that might have been that was against Texas. Yeah, that was against Texas. He came in with the bases loaded and nobody out in his Mississippi State debut, and he strikes out the side. And then he strikes out 7 of the next 9 batters that he faces to finish with 10 strikeouts and a perfect 4 innings of work in his debut. Yeah, his numbers are just off the chart crazy. I mean, he has a good arsenal of pitches, and he just ability to strike guys out is just unbelievable. Something like you've never seen in a long, long time.
Barry, what else has stood out to you around the league? I mean, I feel like it's about to get interesting in a week or two. I know this weekend, I've not checked the schedule. I know Vanderbilt goes to Oklahoma State, which is unbeaten. That'll be a really good test. I feel like we're right on the precipice of where it's going to matter because, frankly, I feel like it's lather, rinse, repeat with these teams every week. You see a team play a mid-major, and every night we're writing these stories where some starters struck out 11 or 12 and the bullpen came in and mowed down another 8 or 9 more. And I just feel like it's becoming repetitive in a good way. I'm really looking forward to the point, because these teams are going to start playing each other where teams that they're playing just aren't overmatched. And I think that I'm really grateful to see that, because I feel like it's hard to learn much more new every week. And because it's the same old thing. These poor teams come into these SEC parks and they just don't have a chance against the pitching staffs they're seeing.
No, and started last week with Mississippi State. They struck out 20 against Southern Miss on Wednesday night, and then A&M gets 21 on Saturday against New Mexico State, and South Carolina struck out 44 guys in the weekend series, 3 double-digit strikeout games against Mercer. Mercer's not a bad hitting team. Was in a regional 2 years ago with Georgia and Florida State, and ended up finishing third in that regional. But that's not a bad club at all. But South Carolina just dominated them on the mound all weekend long. Gave up 1 run, struck out 44, and that's a pretty good. That's a team from the South and pretty good hitting team. Some of these other teams coming in from the the North maybe not been outside as much, but it does look like that the dominance on the pitching, and I do hope we can get some of that this weekend. I think we will. We'll talk more about the series and stuff in our Thursday podcast, but you mentioned Vanderbilt going to Oklahoma State, playing in the new ballpark in Stillwater for the first time. And then the big one to me is South Carolina going to Texas this weekend. 3 games in Austin, all 3 games on the Longhorn Network. I've already got them DVR'd, but all 3 of those games on the Longhorn Network, and get to see that power pitching matchup of Madison for Texas, high pick guy going up against South Carolina's arms this weekend. That ought to be a really fun series to keep an eye on this weekend. Arkansas this weekend going on the road to Louisiana Tech. I think that'll be interesting, because Louisiana Tech beginning Friday night's next 5 home games are Arkansas, Ole Miss. So Lane Burroughs has got it rolling in Ruston to have Arkansas and Ole Miss coming in a 5 games in a 6-day span, into Ruston. And then I think Alabama and Stetson will be kind of an interesting. The Stetson started out undefeated, had a little hiccup this weekend with South Florida and didn't play well. But I think 10-3 overall, getting ready to come to Tuscaloosa this weekend. So those are maybe the top 4, series that you're kind of looking at. I know Samford, who was swept at Florida 2 weekends ago, but gave Florida a really good game on Sunday, will go to Texas A&M this weekend and try the Aggies. That pitching staff, Miller and Jonathan Childress, and that bullpen, has been really good for the Aggies this year.
Yeah, I saw Texas's Ty Madden throw against BYU. It looked phenomenal, which is no surprise. He's a potential top 10 overall pick in next year's draft, or I should say this summer's draft. But one thing that's interesting to me, and I think the explanation is they must have just played enough really bad RPI teams that it affects this. But I'm looking at the RPI by conference, and one thing that's astonishing is the SEC is not only not first, it's not second, it's third, despite a 121-38 record. This is according to WarrenNolan.com this morning. It's particularly galling, I guess, to see the league a spot behind the Big 12, which it has beaten, I think, 8 games to 1, or at least that was a score out in Frisco. So that's one of those odd things, is everybody agrees that the league is the best conference going, and I guess this is the danger of paying attention to RPI early. But the RPI right now does not agree, Barry.
Yeah, and that probably has a lot to do with some of the teams that you played. I mean, Florida just swept Florida A&M. That's not a huge RPI helper there for them. And Arkansas, probably Murray State, hurts you a little bit. Ole Miss has played Belmont. That probably hurts you a little bit. LSU losing 2 at home to a 4-8 Oral Roberts' team doesn't help. When Oral Roberts leaves town and go, hey, half our wins were this weekend in Baton Rouge. And, Mississippi State outside of the Globe Life tournament hasn't played a real challenging schedule. Auburn's 2 wins over Alabama A&M probably, hurts that a little bit. But, you would certainly think that the SEC, was 8-1 at Globe Life against the Big 12. And then they went 3-3 the next weekend in Round Rock. Auburn lost actually went 2-2. Auburn lost to Oklahoma and Baylor, and A&M beat Oklahoma and Baylor. So I guess that's a 10-3 run over the Big 12. You would think that 10-3 would trump 3-10, and you'd at least think they'd be ranked higher than the Big 12 in the RPI. But that'll improve as the season goes along, because when the number 1 team beats the number 3 team, and the number 4 team beats the number 2 team, and the number 5 team beats the number 3 team, that'll tend to even things out, I guess, as we get into SEC play.
All right, I want to get closing thoughts from both of you. I will start with you first, Barry.
Well, I think just try to, this weekend, the last weekend of the regular or the non-conference schedule for SEC, just, teams trying to tune up, fine tune, get their lineups set, get their rotation set, as we get into SEC play next week, which will be, really, really exciting. And everybody's anxious to see how these teams will perform. We've got some teams that have played really well, but, they haven't done it against SEC teams. And I'd like to see, how they do that. South Carolina and Arkansas, the only 2 undefeated teams in the league, at both 10-0 and both in the top 5 nationally for longest active winning streaks in the country. South Carolina, Arkansas has won 14 in a row, and I think South Carolina's won 15 in a row, dating back to last season. So just to see those 2 teams continue to play well and see the teams, how they handle the last non-conference weekend, and then great transition to throw it over to Blake. Just be excited about, watching the SEC tournament and the madness of this weekend, and who gets in and who doesn't get in. And, not as exciting about where's teams going, because they're all going to Indianapolis, but at least there's a tournament this year. We didn't have that last year. And I know, people around the country are excited about that. It was a lonely March last year without March Madness.
Yeah, it was. And by the way, guys, the AP just put out their all SEC awards. Herbert Jones, Player of the Year; Nate Oates, Coach of the Year; newcomer Moses Moody. No surprise there. First team, Herbert Jones, Moses Moody, Cam Thomas, Scottie Pippen, Trendon Watford. Second team, Trey Mann, Severe Wheeler, John Petty, Jeremiah Tillman, Drew Smith. So that is the AP awards. We talked about the others earlier. So yeah, it should be a fun week. I know we got a lot of exciting stuff on the way here. Got an interview coming up. We're not going to say it just yet, Chris, because we always like to hold it to the vest just in case, logistics and all that. But we got another SEC-related interview coming up on Wednesday's episode, so it should be fun.
Yes, I'm excited about that as well. I think this person is going to be a fantastic interview. Cannot wait to have him on the podcast. We've tried for a couple of weeks, but in any case, it's the most wonderful time of the year, guys. It's college basketball is hitting tournament time. SEC baseball is about to get very real soon, and we're going to have you covered here at the 14. Remember to rate, review, and subscribe to our podcast. You can pick that up at Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Of course, follow us on Twitter at the 14. That is actually 14southeastern.com is our handle. And, of course, check out our work at southeastern14.com. Just launched the website a couple of weeks ago. We've got a lot of content up. We're going to have some new features we will roll out soon that I think we're going to be pretty excited about. But anyway, we will have you covered wall to wall. And oh, by the way, maybe some bonus stuff that we're working on, too, in addition to those venues. So we'll see if we can pull that off between now and then. But in any case, for Barry Allen and Blake Lovell, I'm Chris Lee, the host at the 14. Thanks for listening. We'll catch you again on Wednesday.